Welcome everybody to Hope for Our Times, and I'm telling you, we have an incredible program today. Some of you have heard of the Stockholm Syndrome. We're going to be getting into that with our guest. He's never been on Hope for Our Times before. Dr. John G. West, he's Vice President of the Discovery Institute and an award-winning author, filmmaker, and cultural commentator. He's also written or edited 12 books, including Darwin Day in America, How Our Politics and Culture Have Been Dehumanized in the Name of Science. So I'm telling you, we're going to have an incredible program. His documentary films include Firemaker, Revolutionary, The War on Humans, and Human Zoos, and he holds a PhD in government from Claremont Graduate University and has been interviewed by several media outlets, including CNN, Fox News, and Reuters. He was recently on Eric Metaxas too. Doctor, it is great having you here today. Thank you for joining us, Dr. John G. West.
Pastor Tom, thanks for having me.
I'm excited. I've been waiting for this program for some time, and I'm just going to dive right into it. I know you got into it also with Eric Metaxas and many others. But man, I look at things going on in our culture and in this world. We look back at the last several years. There's something out there called the Stockholm Syndrome. And I don't think a lot of people have heard about it. They don't really understand it, but you've written a new book called Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, and you describe how some Christian leaders are more connected to secular culture than their own faith. What does this Stockholm Syndrome idea mean, and why is it such a big problem, not just in our culture today, but also in our church?
Yeah. So the Stockholm Syndrome goes back to an infamous bank robbery in the 1970s in Stockholm, Sweden, where bank robbers held bank personnel hostage, and then about 100 so hours, they were then let go. But something strange had happened by the end of it, and that was that many of the bank personnel end up feeling kindly and gratitude and identifying more with the people who held them hostage than they did with the police or their surrounding citizens. And so I thought that this is really helps me understand what many Christian leaders are about, that seem to sell out their Christianity. So, and I've known this at the personal level, because I think if you think about it, if you become a person of influence and you go into academia or politics or the entertainment media, you've spent your life basically being hostage to secular elites. Either you studied with them in graduate school, you've had to work with them as a peer group, and at the end of that, after years of that exposure where the people around you are these secular elites who basically hate Christianity, you may end up adopting their point of view. And I think that sadly is what many leading Christians have done. And I think a lot of Christians just think if we have more Christians in government or more Christians in the media, everything would be fine. But the fact of the matter is we have lots of Christians in leading positions in all of the culture-forming institutions in our society. The problem is many of them look a lot more like the secular elites than they do with their fellow people in the pews or with their historic Christian teachings from the Bible.
Okay, so it definitely have been affected by culture. I've got to ask you about this in a few minutes. I want to come back to it. I think it's got everybody intrigued that's watching. I think it's one of your books that's behind you, The Biology of the Second Reich.
Yes.
I want to come back to that in a few minutes because that title just totally intrigues me. So let's stick here, folks. We're going to get to that because I know I'm not the only one that wants to know about that. Dr. West, you argue that the collapse of Christianity in America isn't just the work of secularists. So I would ask you this: how have Christian leaders started acting more like secular progressives? And also answer this. To me, it's obvious, but some people it's not. Why is this such a big issue?
Yeah, so I'm glad for asking that. I do think, as a theologically conservative Christian, even I have tended over years to say, well, the atheists are trying to ruin our society. And I don't discount that. But more and more, I began to see how Christian leaders were enabling what was happening. And let's just give a few specifics. Probably the most powerful scientist in America over the last decade was named Francis Collins. He's beloved by many Christians because he wrote a book called The Language of God, giving his testimony of how he was an atheist and became a Christian. And as the head of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, for about 12 years, like I said, he was the most powerful scientist in the United States. But the tragedy is, if you actually look at what he did during his time there, his actions were pretty much indistinguishable from a secular materialist. So one thing he did was that he helped fund a national tissue bank at the University of Pittsburgh with millions of our tax dollars to harvest body parts from aborted babies. Aborted babies up to 42 weeks in gestation. I mean, that's basically infanticide. In order to do research, like, here's one of the research things that he funded. You took scalps off of these poor babies and grafted them onto mice. This was done by America's leading evangelical Christian scientist that he authorized this. This was on his watch. One other example, he declared himself as his term an ally and advocate of the LGBTQIA movement, and he authorized, he was the head of millions of more dollars going to hospitals and doctors who were giving puberty blockers to destroy the lives of young people, and even who were doing surgeries like cutting off the breasts of young women in the name of this transgender madness. And again, this was done by America's most best-known evangelical Christian scientist. So that's one example. Many people are concerned about the redefinition of marriage. But did you know that the judge at the Supreme Court who invented a right to same-sex marriage, that's not in the Constitution, they invented the right, the Supreme Court justice who wrote that opinion was not an atheist, not an agnostic, not a Democrat even. He was appointed by Ronald Reagan. His name was Anthony Kennedy. He was a good church-going Catholic. He attended Mass every week, was known in his personal life as a goody-goody. Yet he invented a right that now is imposed on every state of redefining marriage. And then on and on. I mean, if you look during the COVID crisis of what happened in some of the states where they opened up, like in Nevada, they opened up casinos, but kept churches shut down. Well, that was imposed by a governor, another devout church-going Catholic in that case. And so the thing is, if you actually look about many of these people of influence who are Christians, they're enabling what's going on. They're enabling the cultural destruction. And then, of course, we can also talk about Christian pastors like Andy Stanley and some others, because the first chapter of my book is actually biblical authority, because I think everything else sort of flows from that. And those people who are not willing to uphold biblical authority, then it reaches every part of the culture.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask you about biblical authority in just a second, and even walk us through your book. We don't have the book available here, but where can people get the book, and how do people connect with you?
Sure. So they can go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble online or StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com. That's the sort of website for the book. You'll find a lot of free information there. So StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com. And thanks for asking for a big picture of the book. Basically, it's in 3 parts. The first chapters are called, it's basically the symptoms. So, the symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome Christianity, what's happening in there of biblical authority, science, sex, race and poverty, and religious liberty. And then the next section is causes, that goes back and, what's really causing this stuff? And I talk about how people get their information, the people they're trying to please, the lack of discipline in our organization to hold people accountable. And then the last section is cures. What can we do about it? And in one of the chapters, I actually give 21 practical things that people can do, whether you're a parent, layperson, pastor, church elder, a board member. I have things that you can do. So the goal of my book actually is not just to critique, is to help show things that people can do in their own lives to make a difference.
Great. A couple of things came to my mind while you were talking. You mentioned Andy Stanley. And I remember I was watching an interview with him a couple of years ago, and I'm pretty opinionated, and I tend to stay in line with the things that you're sharing. And he said something most interesting and most alarming, because he has so many followers. And he was asked this question about the Bible, and he was challenged on his belief in the Bible. and specifically the Old Testament in this particular conversation. And he said this. He said, well, the Old Testament was written by these Hebrew people many centuries ago, ancient Hebrew people who were just trying to figure out how to cope with life. So they just came up with these ideas, and that's what they come out with. So that's how he views the Old Testament. And then I recalled it was an interview I listened to. It had to have been 25 years ago. And the interviewer it would be the equivalent of a podcast now. I think it was a radio program. And he asked his person he was talking to, he said, they were talking about Christian colleges and sending away your child to a Christian college. And he said, this is 25 years ago. He said, here's the problem with Christian colleges. And he said, when a parent sends off their kid to a Christian college, they are thinking that they are getting this. They think they're getting the Bible. And he said, what really happens in these colleges is they'll have an instructor. He didn't say all of them are bad. Obviously, not every single one of them are bad. But he said, this is what happens is your kid goes to the college. The instructor is usually very charismatic, sharp, knows how to talk about things. And the person, your child might bring the Bible into the conversation. And the teacher often says, well, does the Bible really mean that? And then they immediately begin to unwind or deconstruct what that your son or your daughter has learned, and doing exactly what the serpent did in the Garden of Eden. God, did God really say that? I had received a message from somebody a couple of years ago, and it was regarding a Christian school, junior high, that I'm familiar with, and they said, my child was there at junior high, and this is, as they described everything, that is exactly what this junior high instructor did 2 years ago. Well, doesn't really mean that. Let's look at the different possibilities of what this really means. And that really, it's this lie that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, and it's in Christianity, in pulpits, in colleges, in seminaries that has undermined all of this. Is that what you see?
Yes, and I have a major part of my book is telling my story at Seattle Pacific University, which still identifies publicly as an evangelical Christian university, but it really isn't. And I was there for 12 years. I had tenure. I chaired a department, and then I decided to leave basically because I saw the direction it was going. Just like 2 or 3 years ago, my former university was in the national news, both in secular and religious media. Why? Because the faculty voted. 72% of the faculty at this supposedly evangelical Christian university voted against their statement on biblical marriage, which was a pretty simple statement that marriage is reserved for a man and woman. How do you have a Christian institution when 72% of the faculty can't even accept biblical marriage? Well, the answer to that is simple. You don't have a Christian institution anymore. And you're exactly right that, and this is really, it's so tragic. And it really makes both me get upset, but also just feel brokenhearted that so many Christians mortgage their future to send their kids to what they think is a Christian college. So they may go into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt to do it. But in fact, it may be one of the worst places they could send their kids, because some of these historically evangelical Christian colleges, if you go there, you'll be taught by people like at my former university who 72% of the faculty reject biblical marriage. While I was there, some of the things being taught included that God himself doesn't know the future. And the number of students who came into my office who I had to counsel and say, well, no, yeah, he does know the future. And I was dealing with people who were being broken by those faculty members. And it was vile what was happening. And so one of the things I want people to know about is that they really need to make sure, if they're going to send their kid to a Christian college, to make sure what's actually going on there. And you don't need to read my book for this. If people go to my website, StockholmSyndromeChristianity.com, in the resources section, you can find a list of questions that you can ask when evaluating a Christian college, that if you ask those questions, you'll get a better idea of what that college is actually doing. But so you are exactly right that the whole Christian, actually K through 12 and then collegiate education there's a problem. Houston, we have a problem. But then going back to Andy Stanley, because I think you're right to hit on him. Andy Stanley is a pastor of one of the largest mega churches in the United States. And if you go to his website, he really talks about come to him for leadership training. So he is training thousands of pastors around the world, and he prides himself in that. I was an elder at a Presbyterian church. Andy Stanley's Baptist, but we were assigned readings from him to learn, leadership from him. And yet he wrote a book in 2018. It's actually dovetails with the interview you heard with him, called Irresistible, where the whole thrust of the book is that the Bible is, and this is his term, the obsolete testament. And he even argues that the Bible, our Christian Bible, should be reorganized to move the Old Testament to the back of the book. And that he basically attributes everything wrong that Christians have ever done is because they believe in the Old Testament. In fact, he even goes so far as to justify, well, it doesn't justify, but to blame persecution against Jews on the Old Testament. The Old Testament is a fault for persecution. In other words, blaming the Jews for their own persecution. I mean, this guy should not be the pastor of a megachurch. He shouldn't be a pastor of a church of 50 people.
Wow, that is, and even the 50 people would be ruined. I mean, when you hear something like that. And unfortunately, this is happening in all kinds of churches all across America. Andy Stanley obviously is very influential, but I keep hearing these things. You can't really believe the Bible. Well, you can believe this in the Bible, not that in the Bible, and right on down this list. You mentioned that some Christians are giving up key parts of their faith in the name of science. You already mentioned Francis Collins, but how does this affect our beliefs? And can you explain why this is also dangerous to the church? I mean, I can figure this out, but we have a lot of viewers. And you look at this and you walk us through that.
Yeah, so Francis Collins, before he was a person of power, and, not just talking about abortion or other issues, he was on the warpath against Christians, fellow Christian scientists who were skeptical of unguided Darwinian evolution or thought that there's evidence of design in biology. Now, the Christian tradition for the past 2,000 years, reaching back both to the Apostle Paul in Romans 1, talking about how God made the world so we can actually see his wisdom there and wisdom and purpose there. In the Old Testament, things like Psalm 19, the heavens declare the glory of God. I mean, it's been Christianity 101, Christian philosophy 101, biblical teaching 101, that we can clearly see the handiwork of God in nature. And yet Francis Collins was really crusading with a lot of grant funding from a particular secular foundation to try to convince evangelical Christians to abandon their criticisms of Darwinian evolution, which Darwin's theory of evolution is not just this over a long amount of time. Darwin proposed that it was an unguided process by chance and necessity without an end in view. And so Francis Collins first started pushing that. And in Collins' view, either really God doesn't really direct things very carefully, as at one point he was arguing that much of our genome was filled with junk. He's had to retract that view, and that was part of his argument for why God really wasn't all that involved. Or he had another option that he said Christians could believe is, well, maybe God made things look random and undirected, but that but we know through the eyes of faith it is, but he just made it look random and undirected. Well, like I said, Christians grounded in the Bible and the early church fathers all were very clear that you can see God did not make the world look like it was, produced by a random and undirected process. So how does it impact people? Well, I mean, if you don't think that God is really directing or God is really sovereign, that strikes at the heart of our belief in the omnipotent God who is sovereign over everything and able to actually rescue us from our own lives, because God actually does know the future and God does guide it. Another problem here, Francis Collins himself has sort of not been clear on his view on this, but one of his associates, Carl Giberson, that he wrote a book together with, has argued that, well, because evolution is driven by selfishness, there never was a time when human beings were morally innocent. We were basically created botched and sinful and selfish to begin with, so there was no fall. Well, if there's no fall, I guess, then what is God saving us through Jesus? Through maybe he's saving us through his own botched creation. I mean, it's just so they often give up on the fall. And so, there's a lot of things that go along with that. And, Collins is one people, but there are other people. And it's really tragic. Many people think that if you make some concessions, well, they haven't denied completely Jesus, so that's okay. Well, it's a slippery slope. And I have one chapter just to what I call slippery slope stories of people who start out making a major concession and, people apologize for them for saying, well, it's just one concession. It doesn't really matter. You look at them 10 years later and they've given it all away. And one particularly tragic example is a scientist who was in the area of science, was at Howard Van Til, who was a physicist at Calvin College in Michigan. And he started out really disagreeing with any Christian who disagreed with Darwinian evolution and arguing on that and saying, pushing back on that. By the time he left Calvin and retired, he no longer was a Christian. He called himself a free thinker. And then a few years after that, sadly, he basically didn't believe in God. He actually said he believed in what he called a comprehensive naturalist view of the world and the universe that doesn't require any God or personal agent. And sadly, very sadly, when a couple of years ago he died, that was his view. So these things, once you start giving up, I mean, the key thing is if you're taking your views about what's true from the world and the culture, as the culture slides down into chaos or into the cesspool, you're going to slide down right along with it. And that is what often happens in these people. Andy Stanley is a good example. So he started out rejecting the Old Testament. In more recent years, he's really been rejecting biblical teachings on sexuality. So it's the gift that keeps giving.
Wow. When I look at this whole subject, I believe that one of the most damaging things that has happened to modern Christianity is Darwinism. It's just been totally destructive. It fires off at the book of Genesis. And when your foundation says, well, you weren't really created by God, that means anything goes in the rest of the Bible. How is eugenics connected with this whole movement?
Yeah, very directly. And I tell part of that story in one segment of Human Zoos, one of my documentaries. And also in my book, Darwin Day in America. So eugenics basically was applied Darwinism. So, Darwin's approach to society is that the only reason human beings have the capacities that we have, that we're rational, that we seem to be the apex of creation, is not because a creator lovingly created us that way, a masterful designer created us that way, a loving God created us that way. It's because we're the product of this blind struggle for existence, and we were able to triumph and exert power, and we're the winners in that. But what that means is, so it's natural selection, the survival of the fittest acted on by these random variations, or acting on these random variations. That's what made us who we are. But if that's the case, if we do things like Christians are called to do, care for the poor, save the sick, be kind toward people that nature would have killed off, we're going to destroy ourselves. And so, if your creator is Darwinian survival of the fittest, not God, and you counteract through being kind the law of the jungle by charity and the things that Christians are called to do, then Darwin thought we're going to destroy our society. So either you have to go back to the law of the jungle so that poor people and people who are sick, just let to die, or you're more compassionate, which Darwin thought he was, and you reinstitute by science an artificial selection that mimics natural selection to weed out the unfit and the lower races. So Darwin also thought that he was a racist and thought that certain races were closer to our, in his view, our evolutionary ancestors with ape-like creatures, and then other races, meaning in his view, whites, were further along. And so eugenics also targeted, the poor, the sick, the ill, and non-white races. And this was the consensus view of the scientific community for decades in America and in Europe. And this led to things like forced sterilization. It led to things like, well, the worst that it led to was in Nazi Germany, because even before they killed Jews, many people don't know that the Nazis killed hundreds of thousands of people in their eugenics program. They first started by forced sterilizing them, and then they ended up sending to gas chambers that were, dressed up as showers. Before they used that on the Jews, they did it to handicapped kids. And that's actually where they perfected the technique that they then used against the Jews. So the Darwinism, there's a very close relationship between, Darwinism provided the intellectual grounding for eugenics.
So you mentioned this with handicapped kids. We also know homeless. The Nazis went after the homeless, and you look at our society, and you hear the talk through the science, also through the medical insurance. We can't afford this anymore, and we've got to eliminate some of the problems. And it's always under the guise of this is for the better good of humanity, as we see things that are taking place in order to eliminate people who are elderly. Assisted suicide. This is, as I look at it, this is exactly what is going on. It is eugenics packaged in a very humane way. And also, from what I understand with eugenics, what happened was with Darwinism, it didn't, because it's survival of the fittest. Well, some of the people that they didn't want to have a lot of babies were having the most babies. The people who are poor, or living in the middle of America, or out in the country, or whatever it was, and the graduates of the higher learned were having less babies.
Yes.
So that created that problem. So hence you have eugenics that comes in, sold to humanity, euthanasia, the whole bit, as a very humane thing, and it's good for everybody.
That's really good to point out, because even under the Nazis, when they were killing the handicapped, it was marketed often as being kind and compassionate. We all think of how horrible the Nazis were, and they were, but their rhetoric against getting rid of the handicapped was partly, this is a humane way. We're taking these people out of their misery. We're also helping the other people in society to be able to survive better. So they did market it in these high-sounding arguments to mask their cruelty. And you're also right that, yes, the eugenics was about breeding a race of supermen from the white, formerly Anglo-Saxon Protestants, because most of these people weren't actually Christians anymore. They were sort of liberal Christians, which means they rejected most of the Bible, but breed more from those higher classes and depress and make sure the lower classes and lower races couldn't breed at all. And so that was definitely at the core of the eugenics movement.
All right, so I'm going to come over to your title for a second, and one of the books that's behind you, The Biology of the Second Reich. What is that about?
Yeah, so this is a documentary. It's only about 15 minutes long. You can watch it on YouTube or Rumble. YouTube has sort of semi-censored it, so you have to sign in to be able to see it. They thought it was, I guess, I don't know. But you could see it without signing in on Rumble. So this tells the story. Most people know about the Third Reich. They know about Hitler. But they don't understand that the Kaiser and what the things that led to World War I, this was well before Hitler. And so Germany, of all the Western European countries, even more than England, where Darwin was from, Germany bought in to Darwinism more than anywhere else. And so the social Darwinism of getting rid of the people they considered unfit, that wasn't just something the Nazis did. That was prevalent in Germany in the early 1900s. And you can't understand what happened in World War I if you don't understand the arguments being made in Germany for actually colonialism in Africa The world's first genocide, modern genocide, is sometimes attributed to German Southwest Africa, where they massacred and destroyed the Herero people, and in fact rounded them up and put them in concentration camps. This was in early 1900s. This was not Hitler. This was under the Kaiser, and they gave evolutionary justifications for it. They actually cited Darwin, and then they had people who were defending the need for war to go against and destroy the lower races as an evolutionary command. And so this documentary, in like 15 minutes, tells the story of how these views took hold, who was arguing for them, and then how they led really to World War I. And then I'm not going to give away the punchline, but there's an interesting punchline at the end of a connection beyond World War I. And so, it's a grim story, but it's one that I wish people knew about, because the problems in Germany didn't just start with Hitler. World War I, which often many people think, well, it was just accidental. Well, there was some of that, but there was an ideology in Kaiser, Kaiser comes from Caesar, Germany, that was justifying in evolutionary terms, in Darwinian terms, of why Germany should basically take over the world, and also why they should commit genocide against groups like the Herero people in Africa.
Wow, I'm going to have to watch it. It sounds absolutely necessary and fascinating. If you don't learn from history, you're bound to repeat it. And although some people are learning, I mean, it just seems like as we listen to what is given to us through mainstream media, through the entertainment industry, and on down the list, everything you're saying and what we've watched over the last 5 years, which I still have to be careful on what I talk about, it appears this is the exact direction we are going. Also, when you read the Bible, you can tell what the end is going to be, and you can start to see this and go, wait a minute, this is happening, and it's on a very broad scale. It's you can see it in virtually every nation, it seems.
Yeah. I do think you've hit on something, which is that people need to, when you talk about the last 5 years and other things, is that people really need to look at where they get their information from. And I have a whole chapter on who do we listen to. And one reason that so many Christians, both leading Christians and those in the pews, end up adopting views that are so much like the surrounding world rather than their historic faith is that they are getting their information about the world from the wrong sources. And so, and I've seen this at the personal level of friends that I know and their kids. If you primarily are getting your information from CNN, the Washington Post, TikTok, or even Google searches, I mean, I go through each of these sources, you're going to end up looking like the world, because even if you start off with solid Christian convictions, say on sexuality or something else, if you're imbibing information sources that are telling you that the biblical view is against the facts, that you can't really live that way, that the Bible is just antiquated and it's not accurate as to what it's teaching you, that say on sexuality, at the very minimum, you're going to be torn between your biblical beliefs and what you now think is reality. But what's more likely is over time, you're going to end up giving up your biblical beliefs because you're filling your mind with this false information about the world. And so I think Christians need to be very proactive. The good news is there are lots of great information sources now by Christians and Christian-friendly things, and that are accurate, but you need to sometimes hunt for them, and you need to use them wisely. And you also need to realize that, see, a lot of people, when they do a Google search, they think, oh, I'm just getting a list of the top websites and maybe the most popular websites or the most recent, or no, you're getting a highly constrained, curated list of results that's designed to push certain views and detract from others. I mean, I'd give one example in the book that it would be an experiment I'd encourage people watching to do. Put in the term crisis pregnancy center in Google, or actually, unfortunately, in a lot of the other search engines. And I will tell you that most of the search engine hits you get will not be a crisis pregnancy center, which those are pregnancy centers that help people not have to have an abortion, to give them great alternatives to that. It will likely be, there's one site called a pregnancy center finder, Crisis Pregnancy Center Finder, that if you actually go to the site, it's attacking these pro-life centers as fake centers that are against women. And so that's the top search result. And then in Google, a lot of the other top search results are related to Planned Parenthood, which is the nation's largest abortion provider. So you're not getting they're not just giving you the most accurate list of things or the list of things you want. They're curating to lists of materials that are of certain points of view that are largely anti-Christian. Same thing when people who rely on Wikipedia or on the chat bots, the chat, GPT and things. All these things are programmed in ways that highlight certain information rather than others, and often what's highlighted is antithetical to the Christian faith.
Well, I'm looking at this. I Googled this right while you're talking, right? So this is what I come up with. What are crisis pregnancy centers by Planned Parenthood? Then it has on here, crisis pregnancy centers, the next abortion battle. Goes on from here. Scholarly articles for crisis pregnancy centers. Here it is. Ready? I mean, you already know this, but I'm telling everybody who's watching, the public health risks of crisis pregnancy centers. That's just one of them. Here's another one. The problems with crisis pregnancy centers. And okay, I got to click on this one because it just looks. And then places to look. Planned Parenthood, to go for a crisis pregnancy center. Planned Parenthood was the first one listed there. Here's another one. Ready? Folks, I'm not making this. I just Googled this while John was talking. Crisis pregnancy centers, faith centers operating in bad faith. So everything you just said, that's live. I mean, I'm just looking at it going, that's right here. John, real quick again, how can people connect with you?
Yeah, so they can go to my personal website, johngwest.com, or on the book, we have lots of free information, even if people don't get the book, at stockholmsyndromechristianity.com.
Great.
stockholmsyndromechristianity.com.
Man, this is just fantastic having you on here today. We have a few more minutes. I want to ask you about a few more things. And I can't wait to watch the documentary on the biology of the Second Reich, too. But you've talked about something called the inner ring, which is the desire to fit in with a specific group. What is the inner ring, and how does it relate to the desire to fit in with certain groups, and why is it so dangerous to Christians?
So in the part of my book where I talk about causes, I talk about three big causes for Stockholm Syndrome Christianity. We're listening to the wrong people, we're trying to please the wrong people, and then we are not holding people accountable. So on the trying to please the wrong people, the inner ring was actually a concept that C.S. Lewis talked about in a talk during World War II, where he warned about the tendency that we have we want to be in the inner circle. That might be another thing, the inner circle where the action is, and that desire to be in that central place of power where, the most powerful in-group is, can end up having us do things that in the light of day we would be, we realize isn't good. In other words, we get sucked in because we want the approval of the inner ring. We want approval of the people, who have the most power or the most prestige, and we want to join them. We will do things to placate them. We will do things to make them know that we're on their side, that then basically makes us abandon our fundamental commitments. And so Lewis had a whole novel about that called That Hideous Strength, which I would recommend if people like to read novels, they should read Lewis's That Hideous Strength, which talks about this. But that's the idea. People want to get into the inner circle, where the power and prestige is, and then they really want to please those people, and then they end up really abandoning their core beliefs over time without realizing it. Sometimes they realize it and they still don't change. So that's the danger, that we're trying to please the wrong people.
And that is a problem with the human nature, is being people pleasing, wanting to be liked, regardless of what people think. By nature, we are selfish, and we want people to like us. So isn't that also what leads to people getting involved in gangs when they're young. They don't find acceptance here. They don't find it there. Or maybe they have a broken home. I mean, there's been a lot of families that have been destroyed because some of the things that are taught in churches. You know, I've often told people in all the years that I pastored, look, you have to have a healthy youth ministry. Because if you don't, people junior high and high school, they're going to look for somewhere to fit in, and they will find it. It's just the natural bent. But what dangers do you see that have come from churches that have destroyed family values? And then one more question after this.
Yeah, no, that's a really important thing. And I think having a youth program that doesn't just deal with relationships but also deals with truth is important, because relationships are really important. But I think sometimes you often hear Christianity is relational, and I think that's true. It is a relationship with the living God and with Jesus and with each other. But if relationships in a biblical sense need to be founded on truth, and so those need to be taught together. And when you don't do that, you end up with really dysfunctional things. You mentioned the example of gangs. I mean, the gangs are one of the most relational groups ever, where personal loyalty is everything. But I think we understand that that's kind of dysfunctional, because gangs, their goals and their purposes aren't great. And so personal relationships, people need to be mentored into having solid and healthy personal relationships, which includes honoring the truth. You know, God is not honored, and nor are we helped by trying to live a lie.
What, in your view, what is the most urgent issue that's facing Christians and Christianity today?
Well, I mean, in one sense, the most urgent issue is that we all need a Savior, and we're dead in our sins. And I think that is the central message of all of churches and Christians, because you're not going to get right with God unless you accept Jesus, and a lot of things flow from that. At a different level, though, more practically speaking, on if people are concerned about where we're going in culture and Christians not sort of living out, or Christian institutions not really being salt and light, there's a principle that I think we can all apply. This is one of 21 things I talk about people being able to do. It's very simple. It's do no harm. So even if you don't think you can do great things, what are you enabling? You have time, talent, treasure, you're volunteering maybe for a local group. Are you actually enabling bad things, or are you at least making sure that in whatever you do, you're not aiding? For example, maybe you went to a Christian college 30 years ago that was a great Christian college. You know that it no longer is, but you're still writing an annual check to them because of a feeling of nostalgia, misplaced feeling of nostalgia or sentimentality. Well, in that case, you're even worse off than the theological liberals who are ruining the institution, because in some sense they think that what they're doing is right. You know that what they're doing is not right, but you're helping to enable it. So I would just, if there's one thing I could ask everyone listening to do, is just take an inventory of their life. Are they doing no harm? How are they using their time, talent, and treasure? Are they at least making sure, and this is not all we're called to do, but are they at least making sure that they're not writing checks to bad, ministries or groups, that they're not wasting their time volunteering for places where they're actually helping a larger, institution go in the wrong direction? So even if you can't change those institutions, don't you enable them. Similarly, relationships, don't enable people's bad, destructive, self-destructive relationships.
That's great. So you have 21 different practical things to do that in the book also. Dr. West, it was great having you join me today. Do you have any closing thoughts for all of our viewers?
Yeah, I think, the ending chapter of my book talks about how God calls us primarily to be faithful, not successful. God is sovereign, so he's going to bring about eternal success. But we're called right now. Sometimes I think people get obsessed over, well, how is it going to turn out? Or, as if it all depends on us. Well, actually, it doesn't. We are called to be faithful, and God can judge us if we're not. But if we're called to be faithful, God finds a way to bless that. And I talk about several times throughout history, from the early church on to modern times, even American history, where if you were a Christian there, you might have been so distraught to think that everything was, that Christianity was going to go out of existence. And yet God brought about a revival, or God did something surprising. I actually talked about God's surprises in history. And so I take heart, we're not called to save the universe, the world. Jesus did that, and God is doing that. We are called to do our little part of being faithful, and God will bless that, either in this life or certainly in eternity. And so I think take heart.
Oh, that's great. Dr. John G. West, thank you for joining us today for the first time here. What a blessing it's been, and looking forward to reading your book myself. And also, I can't wait to watch this documentary too. You can see the links in the description, everybody, for how you can connect with Dr. West and also access his book. And God bless you, everybody. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. West. Thank you for joining me, and looking forward to seeing you again.
Thank you, Pastor Tom. It was great.